And hello, everyone. This is Stephanie Vance, and I want to welcome you to the online advocacy training session for the American Association of Museums. We're going to be talking about creating an advocacy plan for 2011 and beyond. And as we get started here, we'll explain all the muting and Q&A and other details. Just to double check the sound, I want to, if you can hear the sound of my voice, if you could click on the raise your hand button, that would be great, so then I know that you can hear me. Always good if you can hear me. Otherwise, you're just looking at a bunch of slides clicking through. All right, great. We've got hands raised, so that seems to be all in order, and we will get started here. All right, so our topics today, we're going to talk a little bit about the online training session, just some brief details on how it all works. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself for those I haven't met yet, and then we'll jump right into the 7 steps for creating an advocacy plan. And we're going to finish all of this within the next hour, and so we'll all need to be taking notes fast and furiously. Although I know one of the questions will be, and we'll answer that right now, will all these materials be available after the session? They absolutely will. We are recording the session right now, and that file should be available to you sometime in the next couple of days. I have to ask for your compassion for my old computer, which takes a while to convert the file. But there will be a recording of the session, and we will also have the PowerPoint and some of the other materials we're going to share with you available on the speakupformuseums.org site, and I'll show you where that is in just a moment. But for those who haven't been on a webinar before, you may be wondering what's happening. And basically, you have a screen on your computer that's showing the what's happening on my computer. So on my computer, I'm running a PowerPoint, and you can see that, and then you're getting the audio either through your computer speakers or the telephone. Everyone has joined in a mute-only mode, and the reason why we do that is it can get a little loud when you've got right now we've got about 45 people on the call, so when you have that many people on a call, it can get a little loud, which is why everyone's in a mute mode. But if you'd like to ask a question, that's very easy to do. You should find a little box on your screen, the Q&A box, or it should just say questions. And if you see that box, if it's not open, there's a little plus sign next to it. You can click on that plus sign. That should open up the box. You can type questions to me as we go along. If you're not seeing that, it may be that your entire dashboard isn't showing, and you'll see on your screen a small little box, a red background with a white arrow. If you click on that, that will open up a larger screen where you can find the question box. And of course, if you can't find the question box, if there's a technical problem, have no fear, because your questions will certainly be answered after the session. So if you want to email a question in to some of the resource people we're going to share with you in a moment, or if you'd like to simply email back to the invitation address, that would be fine as well. All right, and so one of the questions, as I mentioned, was the recording and follow-up materials. This is the speakupformuseums.org page. You'll see this is the specific advocacy trainings page, and this is where all of that information is going to be archived. So if you want to enjoy this session over and over and over again, you'll be able to through the magic of the internet. All right, so who's speaking? This is a picture of me. I know it's always nice to put a face with a voice, and I am Stephanie Vance. I'm known as the Advocacy Guru. I've written a book that you can see here called Citizens in Action, and basically I have a fair amount of experience having worked on Capitol Hill and having been the person that many people would come into the office and advocate at. Often people would not do it as effectively as I would want them to, so I decided that I could give them some tips and techniques for how to be effective advocates. So that's what I do now, and I do it for a lot of different groups, and I've been very pleased to work with the American Association of Museums for a number of years, both doing in-person training sessions and these online sessions, which have covered a range of topics from using social media for advocacy to putting together museum visits to building long-term relationships with legislators. So it's been a great opportunity to share some of my ideas on advocacy with you. All right. So let's get a sense of where we're starting from, and I've got 2 polls that I'm going to want you to respond to. The first is, how many people are gathered with you to watch this session? And in part, it's useful just to get a sense of how many people are actually joining us, since we only get 1 name on the call. But also as a reminder that if you want to get more people on the call and you want to set it up in a conference room for the next ones we do, that's always fine as well. So. And we'll wait for the votes to come in. We've got 83% of the votes in, 87, 89. You guys are doing better than they do in most presidential elections. 91. All right. Wait a few more seconds. I don't want to restrict anyone's right to vote. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the polls and share with you the results. So most of us, it's one individual, but we've got several people that have got other people joining them for the session. So just a reminder that you can actually do that if you want to set something up in a conference room and get your friends and trustees and others to engage with you on these training sessions. All right, and the next question is going to help us as we move forward through this session is where you are in thinking about your 2011 advocacy planning. Now, you can actually choose as many of these as you like. You may have done some work at the local and state level, but not the federal. So you can choose as many options as you'd like. Or if you've not really done much, that's okay too. Or if you have a complete plan, you're our new heroes. Oh, good, we have some heroes. We have 85% of the votes in. 89. We'll wait a few more seconds. All right, I think we're in pretty good shape. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So you'll see some of us have done some levels, different levels of advocacy planning. You know, a lot of us are sort of in the not really, we're just thinking about it phase. And I think for all of us, this process will sort of help you lay out, if you started it, some ways to move forward on it. And if you haven't really thought about a sort of quick and easy way to start thinking about your advocacy planning. And for the 7% who have a complete plan developed, I hope that you will share with us your tips and techniques, because you get gold stars. You're ahead of everyone, including myself, having a complete plan developed. So, all right. So we have a sense of where we're starting from, and I feel like the materials we put together are going to help everyone on the call. And where I want to start with is just a quick discussion about the differences between advocacy and education. You know, when we think about education, we tend to think about, you know, the idea that our legislators, our elected officials, whether they're local, state, or federal, or the community at large, or our supporters, really need to be educated on the benefits that we bring to the community. I think that's extremely valuable. I also think that advocacy is a bit of a different animal. Advocacy is really about being very specific about a specific cause or a specific goal. So while one of the points of education is often, you know, we want people in our community to feel better about museums or like them better, advocacy is usually about we need this specific level of funding for our museum at this time. So I don't want to suggest that one is more important than the other. What I do want to suggest is that we're really going to be looking a lot more at developing an advocacy plan as opposed to an overall community education plan. Now, that said, a lot of the things that we'll talk about will help in developing a community education plan, because I think that the two are compatible. They work very well together. And the other thing I wanted to mention about advocacy and education is, to me, the idea of advocacy is a little bit like fundraising, and I know everyone on the call has to be involved in that. But when we think about it, one of the main reasons why we wouldn't get dollars from a particular funder or supporter that we're looking at is often because we don't ask. And I think, you know, when we're talking about fundraising, we know that's the #1 reason why we don't get the dollars we want. And that's the same way in working with elected officials. Sometimes we don't get the policy results we want because we really haven't crafted an ask that's going to capture their attention. And then often when we're thinking about fundraising, we think strategically about who's the best person to ask the potential funder whether they'd be willing to support the museum. And it's the same way in advocacy as well. When we're talking to a particular audience member, a particular legislator or elected official, it's always good to have a good sense of that audience and to see if there's someone else in the community who might be a leader who might be willing to talk to that legislator who in fact may already know them. And so we'll talk a little bit throughout the call on how you identify your audience, how you assess that political environment, and craft the message so that you're really going to capture their attention as you move forward. All right. So with that discussion about the differences between education and advocacy, I'm just going to double check and see if we have any questions. Nope, we're good. So we're going to go through these 7 steps, and they are developing your goal, assessing the political environment, learning about your audience, crafting your message, creating an advocate network, building coalitions, and message delivery techniques. So since we have only an hour, you can probably tell we're not going to go into extensive detail on each of these. The idea is to simply give you an outline that you can use to start crafting that plan, and you can delve into the details as they relate to your specific community. So step one is defining the goal. And again, this needs to be a little bit beyond, we want the people in our community to like our museums better. We want our elected officials to think about our museums. It needs to be something that you sort of think of as pretty specific. Even if it's, we want continued funding from the state for museums. We want continued IMLS funding. I know that's something that the national organization is working on. We want no cuts. I think asking for increases this year might be a little difficult, but it's always possible to ask. Looking for funding for a specific project, or even thinking about some policy changes. And the reason why I suggest that you start by defining the goal is because once you know what it is you want, you'll be able to move to step two, which is assessing the political environment. It's very hard to figure out the political environment before you know what it is that you're going to want from a specific audience. So if you've figured out what your goal is, your next step to yourself is how can you achieve your goal? And I think of this as the chain of command, hence the chain graphic there. Figuring out who the chain of command is for achieving your goal. You'll want to know who makes the decisions. You'll also want to know, is there more than one avenue? And importantly, what are the sort of general core values of your audience? So for example, if you're thinking about asking for continued funding at the state level for museum programs, who makes those decisions? Well, often it's the state legislators, so you're going to want to, we're going to talk a little bit about finding those particular audience members, but you'll want to know generally it's the state legislature. Sometimes you want to know if there's more than one avenue, so there may be an agency, a state-level agency involved that you want to know a little bit about. Maybe it's not just the legislature that makes that decision. Maybe it's the governor as well, so you want to get that information. And then you'll want to think about sort of broadly what are those core values. So for a lot of different state legislatures right now, there's some of the core values are jobs and the economy. And that's really going to help you figure out how you're going to frame your messages generally in a way that's going to make sense to them. And you'll want to keep targeting those messages as you talk with very specific individual legislators. So this assessment of the political environment also involves not only looking at your audience and sort of that chain of command, who can get you your goal, but also some of your own community factors, because that's going to help you as you think about the other part of your advocacy plan, which is getting others involved in advocating to that audience. So you're going to look at some community factors. What is the economic situation in the community? What is, for example, the rate of unemployment? Is it increasing or decreasing? What are household income? What's happening with household incomes in the community? Are you seeing, is it a fairly affluent community or is it a less affluent community? These are just some basic things you'll want to know, and probably information you already have from work in fundraising and generally promoting the museum. Demographics, you'll want to know some of the things about the different cultural aspects of the community, whether it tends to be a younger-oriented community, an older community. You'll want to know if there's different language and ethnicities within the community, because that's really going to help you figure out when you start talking to your audience who might be the best people within your community to talk to those different legislators. You also want to know things like previous support. If you take a look at any past advocacy campaigns you may have had, or any, I know many museums get involved in local mill tax millages to try and get more funding for their museums, et cetera. You want to see, how did that support go? Where did that support come from? Were there specific counties or communities that particularly were supportive of that you got very strong votes from? That kind of demographic information is, again, going to be useful when you start reaching out to the audience. And you also want to think about the connections of museum activities and the focus on the community, what the community thinks of the museums, how often you are going out to the community, what kinds of attendance you get at any of the activities you hold within your museum. This will give you, all of the answers to these questions will give you a pretty broad picture of your community, because then what you'll need to do is take that picture, match it up with the political environment for the people who are your audience, who are the people who can help you get your goal, and then we'll talk about how you make those matches, how you make sure that you've got the right people in the community, contacting the right people in the legislative offices. But with those two pieces, what you really got is hopefully a strong assessment of the political environment. that's really going to help you as you want to move forward on your goal. All right, excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of water. All right, step 3 is really doing some specific work into learning about your audience. And actually, before I talk about that, one thing I want to do is, if you've got a specific goal in mind, something that you are really thinking about very specifically for your museum in the next year or 2 years, if you wouldn't mind, please go ahead and type that goal, even if it's just a short statement. We want to get more funding for a new facility or something along those lines. Go ahead and type that goal into the Q&A box, because when we come to crafting our message, I'd like to use an example from someone on the call who's got a very specific goal that they'd like us to focus on. So we've talked about thinking about that goal. We've talked about assessing the political environment. Now we're going to talk a little bit about learning about your audience. So you need to figure out some key things about this audience that you're going to be reaching out to. And these are some of the key questions you'll want to know. What or who influences them? And one of the ways that you can find out the answer to that first question is by thinking about the answer to that second question, which is, how did they get into office? So in our very general example of wanting to continue funding at the state level for museums, if we've decided the state legislature is our overall audience, we want to ask ourselves, how did those state legislators get into office? Well, for the most part, they got into office through elections. So who influences them? Hopefully they're voters. And when you start to get to that level of understanding of the audience, you'll recognize, well, if it's the voters that influence the state legislators, then the people that I need to try and get to are the voters. If you're trying to deal with a federal or state agency, on the other hand, you might have people who got into office because they were appointed. And so you'd have to think to yourself, well, how did they get into that office? They were appointed. Who appointed them? Who controls their budgets? And once you're able to answer those questions, it will help you figure out who has the most influence over that specific audience member. And this is really key to know, because when you want to try and get that particular audience member to move forward on your goal, knowing who influences them is going to be critical, because those are the kinds of people that you're going to go out to and ask them to assist you with trying to get the people in the legislature to pay attention, or in the agency to pay attention to your particular issues. The other thing you want to know is, what jurisdiction do they serve? And this is really critical. In the state legislature, they have very specific legislative districts that they serve, same as in the federal legislature. And you're going to want to know how very specifically your museum relates to those legislative districts. Now, I know a lot of times people think, well, I want to keep funding for our overall state level program, so I should just contact the chair of that particular committee who handles that. Well, the chair of that committee is going to be less interested in general communications from people all over the state, and more interested in communications from people specifically in their legislative district. So to the extent that you and your museum can demonstrate a connection to that legislator's particular district, that's going to be very helpful. If you can't demonstrate a connection, I suggest contacting your own legislator. And remember, as a museum, you have sort of a wide footprint. So you're going to have where the museum is located, possibly where you live, possibly where trustees, friends, funders, other people live, where you draw your visitors from. So you'll probably find, when you start looking at your footprint, that you serve a lot of different jurisdictions. And when you find that, you want to connect who are the people who serve those jurisdictions to your particular museum, so that you can reach out to them and say, hello, Congressman so-and-so, we have 200 visitors a day that come into our museum from your district. We really want to talk with you about this particular funding issue. Also, in terms of thinking about jurisdiction, especially when you're looking at the local jurisdictions, city and county, it's very important to know, for example, that a city council member represents a very specific ward of the city. And sometimes we make arguments to city council members that are all about the general good of the city. Frankly, a lot of times they don't really care about the overall good of the city. They just care about the good of the very specific area they represent. It's also true when you think about the differences between city and county commissioners. Sometimes when we talk to the city folks, we talk about some regional benefits that the museum brings, but the city folks are going to be less interested in regional benefits than the larger county folks. And so understanding those jurisdictional differences are going to be really critical if you're starting to craft that message. Also, in thinking about the individual audience members, their personal interests, really important. One of the things some of the things you want to know about them are what kinds of policy interests do they have? What kinds of bills have they introduced? Are they, even personal interests like, do they have an interest in, are they a Civil War buff? Do they have an interest in a certain type of literature? And if you can find out this information, you can, first of all, be able to frame your message in a way that's going to capture their attention. But you can also, as your museum gets, if you get in different events having to do with some of the things that they're interested in, you can let them know, and you can have it stuck in your head. Oh yeah, a city council member really loves, I don't know, the history of medical tools or something. And so you can get that individual to actually physically be in your museum if you've got some related exhibits that you'd want to share with them. Also, personal relationships to museums is really important. Any particular audience member, a specific state legislator or a city council member, I always suggest, and I know this sounds very unsophisticated, but try Googling their name and the word museum. And when you do that, you'll find that sometimes these folks are already members of their friends group. They already have been trustees for museums. Even sometimes you can find out, that they have a subscription to a particular museum. So that kind of very basic information can be very useful, especially as you're starting to build that relationship with them and to get some of that background information. Now, one of the ways to get a lot of these resources, if you go to the speakupformuseums.org site, and this is the home page, so all you need to do is type in speakupformuseums.org, and you can see right here there's the Contact Your Congress box. And on this box, you can very easily type in your zip code. So if someone wants to type into the Q&A box their zip code, I'll show you how easy it is to use this to actually look up both your federal and your state legislators. All right, so we've got the first one in is 18951. So we'll go ahead and go to that. Now, this is when I was looking up my mom. You know what's weird is I think the new Congress hasn't been completely updated yet. So actually what I'm going to do, because I was testing this earlier, is I'm going to use my mom's address so I can type in the full address. And because I know everyone's curious about where my mom lives. So she lives in California, and this is all the full information. But you'll see that not only do you get the information about your federal legislators, but you also get the information about your state officials. And I know many of you are going to have advocacy efforts that are state-based. So I would very much recommend that you use this to find your state elected officials. And then you can click on that link. So this is Assemblyman Dan Loeb. Now you'll find that there's probably, in a lot of cases, not going to be a ton of information right now because it is the start of the new congressional and state legislative sessions. But as you click through, you will find, often you will find links to their websites. The newer ones may not have links yet, but this is where you can find out a little bit about Dan Loeb, who is California State Assemblyman from the 3rd District. So I just point that out. I know a lot of people know that resource is available, but it is a great way to figure out some of these basic questions of who these people are, how they got into office, the jurisdictions they serve, and who may specifically influence them. Because for the example we just looked at of Dan Loeb of the 3rd District of California at the state level, people who are going to be most influential with him are the people who are in that particular legislative district and who are voting or not voting for him. So those are some of the secondary audiences that you're going to want to be able to reach out to. All right, so step number 4 is crafting your message. And I'm going to talk a little bit about crafting the message, sort of the details of it, and then I'm going to, I've got some great examples here that I want to share with you all, and we'll talk about how you might develop a message using some of those examples. So the very basic details of crafting the message, being specific, so again, being very specific about what it is you want your audience to do for you, whether it's funding or policy changes, et cetera. Knowing your audience, and we've talked a lot about some different things you can learn about your audience and kinds of questions you need to answer and where you can get that information. Framing the message. So this has to do with the idea I'd mentioned earlier of knowing something about what that particular legislator is most interested in, and not just their personal interests, but also the kinds of policy interests they have. So knowing that, for example, we were looking at Dan Logue's website, and he had a lot of information up there about jobs and economic development and those kinds of important issues. So we know that when we talk to him, we probably want to talk about the economic benefits of the museum to his particular community. If we have a legislator who's very interested in environmental issues, we might want to talk about the steps that the museum's taking to green the community, or the things that the museum is doing to help protect the environment. If we have a legislator who's very interested in technology, we talk about what the museum is doing to promote more 21st century approaches and learning skills. The next point is to really focus on the benefits. And the reason why I talk about this is because to their credit, when I talk to people about focusing on a goal and a specific ask, there's a lot of focus on the goal and the specific ask, which is great. But we have to remember why we're asking for these things. And we're not necessarily asking for these things simply because we want them for our particular museum. We just think it would be cool to have a new building, but because we want to provide some very specific benefits to the community. So starting with the focus on those benefits can really help the legislator understand this isn't just about wanting more money for a particular museum. It's about wanting to provide specific types of benefits to the community. And then making it real is all about being able to tell that personal story. What you really bring to this particular process is the connection between the sort of odd things that happen in the political arena and what actually happens on the ground on a day-to-day basis in your community. And so you do that through telling those personal stories. So for example, if you're talking to your legislator about making sure that schools have enough funding to make sure that school kids can get in to visit museums, you want to talk about some very specific activities you've done with schools in your community to make sure that the kids can have access to all of the great resources that you have at the museum. And you want to make sure that you get those stories as personal as you possibly can. If you've received a thank you letter from the kids at a particular school, that kind of thing is exactly the thing you want to share with the people, with the legislators or the agency folks that you might be trying to influence. So let's take all of these points that we were just talking about, and I want to give you a little bit of a message formula so that you can use this to develop a message that will hopefully resonate based on some of the principles I just talked about. Now, sorry, my computer is giving me weird lines. Let me make sure that it's not giving, it is giving you weird lines too. All right, we're going to close that out. I'm going to just move the slides around here a little bit so that there we go. All right, so I did have some folks who shared with us some of their goals, and so I want to talk a little bit about those. Let's see. All right, so I've got one of the first ones here is funding for a national historic landmark vessel. So I think that's a nice, very specific one to start with. So what I might do is I would go and I'd learn a little bit about the audience that's going to be able to give me that funding. And let's say it's a specific legislator. So I would probably go to that legislator, and let's just imagine that that legislator is interested in, I don't know, transportation issues, because that seems like it might be somewhat connected. So I would say, knowing of your interest in transportation issues, we want to talk to you about our ideas for supporting funding for a national historic landmark vessel. We represent X number of constituents, so you'd want to make sure that you're demonstrating to him or her why you're relevant to them. And we would like to provide them with the following specific benefits. And so I would there talk about what are the benefits of having this landmark vessel in the community. What can they learn about, what sort of historical facts can they learn about the community? How can they bring that back to what's happening in the community today, et cetera, et cetera. Then I would say to do so, we are seeking, and that's where you would put in the specific level of funding that you'd like for this specific program. So we are seeking, I don't know how much it is, X thousands of dollars for this particular program. And we believe this is important to your constituents because, and that's where you would tell that personal story. So that's where you would say, we believe this is important because we have heard from people in our community that there's a lack of connection between what our community does and its historic background, and we feel that if we enhance the understanding of the historic background of the community, people will understand how we got from where we were to where we are now, et cetera, et cetera. You guys know the benefits of what you're trying to do better than I do, but that's sort of the way you want to do it, and to the extent that you could get personal quotes from people in the community about those benefits, that would be helpful in telling that personal story. And then you'd want to pull it all together in that closing statement. We hope that you will be a partner with us. I always like to use that phrase with audiences. We hope you'll be a partner with us in providing, and then that's where you list the benefits, because remember, you're not just wanting to get money for something. You want to provide benefits to the community, and then letting them know, here's how you can be part of providing those benefits. So let's look at another one. I know a lot of people are going to be working on funding for IMLS, so this was another goal that was established. So funding for the IMLS to establish statewide assessments and a formula grant program that was included in the recent reauthorization. And so we all know that Congress can authorize all it wants, but it never actually funds a lot of things, which is sometimes a little frustrating. So the idea here is that there would be actual funding for this to do the statewide assessments and formula grant program. And so that's where we would take the same formula. We'd be talking to federal legislators about it. So we'd find our federal legislator, and we'd, in this case, since it's a statewide issue, might start with knowing of your interest in supporting the services available to citizens in our state. We'd like to talk to you about this particular issue. We represent X number of your constituents and would like to provide them with the following benefits. And then explain what the benefits would be of the formula grant program. And then to do so, we are seeking you to, and then explain how much funding you'd want specifically for the IMLS to do this. Now, I should note that a lot of this information is going to be available from the museum's national office, so your government relations team can help you out with that. But the point here is to figure out how to take your goal and express it in a way that that particular audience member is going to be particularly attracted to. And the keys there are to list those benefits, to make it relevant to them by knowing something that would actually interest them, and to connect it to the people that they represent and be very specific about what it is you would like them to do. So I just want to quickly mention some of the other goals that people have, because I think one of the benefits of these calls is that you kind of hear that people have very similar goals to you. We've got a couple people that are going to be working on funding for their capital campaign. We've got folks who are wanting to raise private capital to match public capital. And so I should note that a lot of these principles that we're talking about of knowing your audience and crafting your message are applicable in the private sector as well. So don't ever feel like, oh, it's just about the public. It works in the private venues as well. Funding for the advocacy of peace, so programs designed around how we can learn from our past. I think that goes back to the historic points I was making earlier, and I think very critical, especially after some of the things that have happened recently in the United States, which are pretty terrible. Major cuts, avoiding major cuts for state-funded museum. We've got a lot of people who are working on that. Finding funding to provide pre-service training for teachers to help them use the museum and other resources. That goes back to that issue of getting schools more connected with the museums. And then I've got a question here about any advice about working across state lines on a multi-state project. That's a good question. It depends on who the overall audience is. So if it's trying to coordinate several different state legislatures, I would suggest that each of the museums that are working on the multi-state project identify their connections to their own state legislatures. And for example, I don't know where you're located, but Kansas City is always a good example because you're working across state lines there. So you find the museums on the Kansas side who are able to find their legislators in Kansas, find the museums on the Missouri side who are able to find their legislators in that legislature, and have each of them communicate with their own state legislatures. Because frankly, if you're working across state lines, the state legislators in one state aren't really going to care about the museums in the other state. unless you can demonstrate that you have visitors that come from their state to your museum. But the real key there is to make sure that the right people are talking to the right state legislators, because it's not going to work if you've got people from one museum in one state trying to influence the other state's legislators. They're probably, I wish I could tell you that they would care, but they don't. So the key part of that coordination is going to be each of the museums involved in the project figuring out who needs to talk to whom in which of the state legislatures. All right. So we've talked about 4 of the steps. Step number 5 is creating an advocate network. And to do so, I think you're going to need to answer 3 key questions. And the first question is, where can we find advocates? And I should note there's going to be kind of 2 aspects of creating the network. One is going to be talking a little bit about the individual advocates, and that's what we're going to talk about here. And then we're going to talk a little bit about building coalitions, how you can find coalitions that will support your efforts. So question 1, where can we find advocates? And I ran through a list here: friends, trustees, funders, visitors, volunteers, employees, local partners, educators, and students. There's probably a huge range of others that you can find. You know, obviously, when I say local partners, local businesses that support you. But when we start thinking about advocates, it's not just a matter of the people who are employed by the museum or associated sort of directly with the museum. Start thinking more broadly. Every time you do a program or are working with people in the community to put something on or to promote it, those also, in addition to helping you with a very specific project at the museum, they can also be folks who will be advocates for you when you start trying to communicate some of these messages with your legislative or regulatory audience. Question 2 is, how can we organize advocates? One of the things that I think is really important is what I call a volunteer intake form or an advocate intake form. And this is something that you can use as you've got someone who, you know, as you're talking to people and they say, hey, we really want to know how we can better support the museum, I would ask them to fill out a form like this. And for folks who are wondering, yes, this will be available on that follow-up website, so you don't need to write all this down, but it's just sort of an example. And you can ask them to say, you know, how they hear about the effort, have they had experience, et cetera. One of the key things I think to know is whether they know any elected officials personally. And, you know, assure them you're not going to use that information for nefarious purposes. But it's always good to know when you start working with people what their connections are. And, you know, you review all this information. You have it in a database. I'll show you a database sample in a moment. But then when you're talking to the state legislature about a funding issue and you remember that, you know, so-and-so is on the committee, and you remember back to your volunteers and you think, oh, yes, my volunteer X knows that state legislator, that's going to give you a very powerful connection to that state legislative office that you might not have had if you hadn't collected this information earlier. And then kind of getting a sense of what people would be interested in doing. We'll talk in a minute about some of the delivery techniques that advocates can use to help get the message across, and whether they have any particular expertise. You know, if you've got someone who's got legal expertise who can keep track of the accounting, you know, I know for me, man, I'd love that. But they may have marketing or writing or that other kinds of expertise. And I just suggest the moment you've got anyone who's interested, having them fill out this sort of simple form so that you can have that information. It's much better to have it at the start of the effort than it is to sort of be trying to grab it as you're in the midst of a hot and heavy legislative crisis. Now, one of the ways that you can sort of keep track of this information, I put together a very simple Excel spreadsheet. It's an organizing spreadsheet you can use once you get that information in. You can include it in a sheet like this. You can, you know, have an intern do it, et cetera. The key things, obviously, their name. This street address information is pretty critical because that's going to tell you who represents them, how they're connected to the museum, their past experience, their skills and interests. Obviously, I'm an Excel whiz. And connections. So I know the museum's GR staff, but I also might know some state or local legislators that would be important to you as you move forward on the process. Also think about, you know, as you collect some of those volunteers and those advocates, you're probably going to know, because they're people who you know, who might be good leaders, who might be good people to help bring along other advocates who may be newer to the process. So seeing if you can identify 3 or 4 people who would be good key contacts or advocate leaders, perhaps starting a smaller steering committee with them where they really help set and drive some of the advocacy activities of the museum. Training, I think, is important, and the good news is, again, at the Speak Up for Museums page, there's access to all of these online trainings, so they can review those, and you can always feel free to use the materials that are up there for your own training purposes. Also, creating an advocate network, question 3, how can we activate advocates? And we'll talk in a moment about some ideas for delivering the message, some quick thoughts on that. But tools for activation, you might want to think about, online. Usually the easiest thing is to have an email list that you send notices out to. Obviously, I hear the kids these days are all doing social media, so having a Facebook page or Twitter, that sort of thing. We actually have an entire recording of an online training session that's on social media and advocacy. So I encourage you to check that out because I think those tools for activation are pretty powerful. And even the old-fashioned offline ones, making sure that at every desk at the museum there's a flyer about the advocacy effort you're undertaking, even if you can't be super specific on it because you might have some restrictions on how much quote-unquote lobbying you can do. You can certainly have a flyer that talks about the benefits that the museum brings to the community and particular threats to funding, et cetera. Determining when activation is necessary, I tend to think that there are several different points for citizens to communicate with legislators in the legislative process, whether it's local, state, or federal. And part of your job as an advocate leader is going to be to make sure that they know what those points in the process are. So they may be upon bill introduction, they may be upon committee hearing, committee markup, having different resolutions considered on the House floor, having them move to the Senate, et cetera. So just taking a quick look at the calendar for your state legislature if you're working at the state level and trying to get a sense of what are the points of citizen input and helping your network understand when they can communicate, I think, is important. And we'll talk in a little bit about delivering the message, some of the steps that they can take. But do remember that Speak Up for Museums is a resource. It has a lot of different recordings right now on all of these different questions. All right, so there's 2 aspects to your network, as I noted earlier. There's the individual volunteers, and then there's the different coalitions that you might reach out to in the community. And as I've been alluding to, there are actually recordings on the Speak Up for Museum site on a whole process for building coalitions. So we're just going to touch on it briefly here. But the key, I think, to coalitions is not necessarily to look around your community and say, gee, who else likes museums? We should get them involved, although that's certainly one way to do it. But I tend to think that it's far more effective to look at the particular audience you're trying to influence and see what kinds of coalitions might interest that audience. So when we look at a state legislator who might be very interested in promoting jobs in the economy, I would probably then try and see if I could find a local business or the local chamber of commerce who'd be willing to go to that legislator and say, hey, do you know how wonderful the museum is for promoting jobs in our community? If I knew of a legislator who was very interested in education issues, I would go to the school and ask the school to be the one to go talk to that particular legislator. And that, to me, is a way to think of coalitions. Not just in the do they all like us, let's get together and do stuff sense, which is how we usually think of coalitions, but really in the who are we trying to influence and what group would be most effective in influencing that particular audience. Identifying coalition partners, look in the same places that you looked for individuals. Just look for some of the organizations that they're associated with. I think you'll be surprised as you start looking at some of those organizations how many potential coalition partners you may have. Approaching them is a matter of, if you have an individual who you know is very closely associated with the Chamber of Commerce, ask them if they'd be willing to approach the leadership. Sometimes you may not be the best person to do the approaching, but you may have other people on your team who are. And as with the individual advocates, I also suggest a coalition intake form where every time you've got an organization that says, yes, I want to work on your advocacy effort with us, with you, have them fill out this form. It gives their organization name, et cetera. Good to know what their structure is. Are they member-based, foundation, single entity? Because if they're member-based, then you might have a whole host of other people that you can engage in the advocacy effort, and that's why you want to know how many members they have and what type. What's their connection to the issues? So what kind of relevant arguments are they going to bring? Again, if you're talking to the chamber, their connection might be about building the economy in the local community. If it's the school, it's about promoting education, et cetera. Again, those connections, I think, are very important to know. And then getting a sense of even some of the basic information that the expertise or resources that they can bring to the effort is useful. And this kind of information you can keep in a similar kind of Excel spreadsheet as to what I put together for the individuals. You'll probably have fewer coalition groups involved, so you may not need to do that sort of thing, but good to collect this information early on. All right, so delivering the message, a few quick tips, and I'm just going to check to see if we have any additional questions at this point. Nope, we're good. So meetings, when and where can meetings occur? Obviously, you can have meetings at the local level, state level, federal level. You definitely need to take a look at the calendar, especially if you're working at the state level, because many state legislatures are kind of getting going now, and some of them wrap up in 3 months, or some of them are supposed to wrap up in 3 months and then don't. But in fact, getting a sense of their timeline, seeing if there's an opportunity to get some supporters down to the Capitol at some point, and also thinking about meetings in the legislator's legislative district. Now, I have to say, after the truly horrific events in Arizona this weekend, I'm a little nervous, frankly, about suggesting to people that they attend events with their elected officials in person, just because it's so terrible what happened. And I'm just personally concerned about the effects on citizen discourse, but that's a different issue. But at a minimum, you can, if you're thinking about meetings, do try to get people to the Capitol. And any events that a legislator has already put together definitely is something to consider getting people to. And even, of course, have the events that legislators might be having at your particular facility are something to consider as well. In the meeting, you're going to want to think about who should deliver the message. Again, that person who's got the closest connection to your particular audience member. So if it's a very conservative member, you're probably going to want to have a business person deliver the message. So matching that up with your audience is going to be very important. Arranging is going to be very different depending on your particular community, state, or local situation. I would suggest talking perhaps to the state. There's usually a state association executives organization. We have a national one, and I know most of the states have one as well. And seeing if they have any advice on how people generally arrange lobby days or fly-ins if you're going to be going to the Capitol. But usually it's simply a matter of calling the different legislative offices and asking for meetings for the folks who will be attending. And then, as part of just having a very quick agenda for what will happen in the meeting, making sure that you've got the right people who are delivering their messages to the right time, to the right people, and making sure that those personal stories are very connected to the messages that you're trying to deliver. So if people have got a great story about how a school group managed to get into the museum and the educational benefits that brought to that group, that's a great story to make sure that comes out in the meeting, especially if you're meeting with a legislator who's interested in education. And then making sure that as part of those meetings, you've got a follow-up plan, really critical. A lot of times these meetings have, people go to these meetings, they're great, and then nothing really happens afterwards. So making sure that if you do a meeting that you try to connect up with them through some other means afterwards, such as phone calls and written communications, which we're going to talk about now. And one of the ways you can get these advocates that you've developed through the sort of personal network and the coalition network to communicate with your audience is through phone calls. Quick couple points there. You want to sort of balance, and this goes to the first 2 points, you want to balance the benefits of having a script so that they know what they're talking about with them being able to develop a personal and passionate story. Usually the phone calls are most successful if the advocates are able to tell their own stories and weave those into the talking points that you've suggested to them. So using that message exercise I used earlier, that might be something that you can help the advocates walk through a phone call or whatever, so that they know, okay, I have to tell my personal story here, and I have to tell how it connects to the important message of continuing funding for museums. One of the key things of phone calls is to make sure the advocates always ask for a response. It's too easy for the office when someone's calling in to say, yes, thank you so much for your call, and just to sort of mark a tick box that says there's people who called in support of this. But if the advocate asks for a response, then the office needs to write down their address and send them a letter or other kind of communication in response. And it tends to more forcibly drive home that the advocate is very interested in knowing what the legislator is specifically going to do on this particular issue. Written communications, also very important. And when we say written communications, we should just note it's not just letters. Actually, pieces of paper coming to Washington, D.C., if that is your target audience, go through a post office in New Jersey where they are irradiated because everyone's concerned about anthrax. So actually written pieces of paper going to D.C. not always such a good idea. Emails and fax communications are often better. But for any type of written communication, these are some of the key elements you need to have. You need to have that call to action. It's too easy for a legislative office if you write in saying we need more money for museums, for them to say, I love museums. Museums are wonderful. They are the economic engine of growth and opportunity and the beacons of democracy and all kinds of phrases like that. And when you send a general letter, they'll send a general letter back and nothing is really accomplished. So it's that call to action, that very specific ask that needs to be part of the written communication. I'm not going to lie, you'll probably get a very general letter back, but that's when you write back to them and say, thank you for your letter, but what I really wanted to know is, are you going to continue to support funding for IMLS in this way at this time? Also in the written communication, very much like the personal meeting, the personal story is critical. Connecting that very broad policy or funding message that you're trying to deliver with how it impacts people on the ground every day. Relevancy, making sure the legislator knows that you are from their district, you are serving people in their district, you are related in their district in some way. That's really going to be the very first framework through which they look at most of the messages that come into their office. And of course, in written communications, trying to keep it brief. For any email communication, you should try to keep it to one screen. For any fax or that sort of thing, no more than one page. It'll really help get the attention you want focused on it if it's not more than one page, because then the staff know that you're really giving them just the nitty-gritty details that they need. Now, I know I've gone over about a bazillion things in a very short period of time, and so what we've put together for you is an advocacy planning worksheet, and this is going to go through everything that we just talked about. This is again going to be available on that site that we shared with you earlier. But it takes you through each of these steps. So identifying your goal, how can you achieve your goal, who makes those decisions, is there more than one avenue, what are some of those core values, a little chart here to help you figure out knowing your audience, and this would be available in Word so that you can type into this directly. Some opportunities here to create your messages, so you can actually type in using this formula, and you don't have to use this formula specifically, it's just kind of a way to help you think about creating winning messages. Thinking about the individual advocates, where you might find them, who they are, if you've got any training you can provide for them. Building coalitions, who might you approach, and then some ideas on some very specific message delivery techniques, how you might implement them. And of course a timeline, and we've got January through July here. You can extend it out if you like, but to give you some action items each month based on everything that you've developed as part of the earlier part of the plan. So we hope that will be a useful resource for you. And I'm going to talk in a moment about a few other resources and get some ideas about what steps you might want to take next. But I want to just note here, I got a note about a very successful effort, and I want to just highlight this for folks. Connecticut recently had a successful coalition effort in support of tourism that included museums, sports venues, and hospitality service industry leaders and frontline staff. And the group invited the gubernatorial candidates to speak on tourism issues prior to the election. All three candidates participated, and the tourism message had center stage. We won't know, obviously, the impact on actual spending, but at least they know that tourism is an issue and that museums contribute positively to that. So I think that's a very good example of how even just getting legislators and some of your target audience members into your museum is will be very useful to overall funding issues as they come up in the legislature and in the gubernatorial or in the agency budget making process. In this case, for example, you've got the candidates there who are thinking about the overall budget for the state. When they start thinking about that, and if you go back to them and say, "Hey, remember we had this tourism forum in our museum, and we talked about the benefits that the museum provides to tourism," it's something that will resonate with them because they've already participated in some way. So, a very good example, and one that I think others in the museum world should consider following. All right. So what are you going to do next? I want to open up our last poll and just get a sense from you all of what are some of the actions that you might take next based on what we've just talked about. And you can select as many of these as you like. Are you going to work more on identifying your goal, assessing the environment, learning about the audience, developing a message and building a network to deliver it, or identifying specific opportunities for delivering a message? Are you going to do all of those? You may have already done some of these, so you may not need to. And hopefully if you're going to do all of them, you'll use the worksheet we put together for you, because that will hopefully keep everything in one place. And while we're waiting for the remaining votes to come in, I just want to mention that Museums Advocacy Day 2011 is coming up. I hope that on everybody's worksheet plan that February 28th through March 1st will be one of the activities that on those dates, Advocacy Day will be one of the activities you're considering. It's just so critical to get people to Washington, D.C. to talk about these issues, especially in this particular legislative year. And registration is going to be open until January 21st. So if you haven't registered yet, please do so as soon as possible, or have someone from your museum or coalition that does. And we're just waiting for a few more votes to come in, and then I'll close and share the results. All right, I'll go ahead and close and share the results. So we've got, most of us are going to do pretty much everything that we've noted here. I note that some people are going to do one thing or another, which is good, because that means that probably you've already done taken a lot of these steps, and hopefully they're going to serve you well as we have to go through, again, another difficult funding year, I know, for a lot of us. All right, so as I mentioned on the other resources, you've got the Museums Advocacy Day 2011. And again, the registration is open until January 21st. The reason why we can't have it open much longer is because it's going to be a difficult year to get things scheduled, since many offices don't have phones or staff or offices. So we'll be plugging away to get those meetings scheduled as soon as possible. You've got speakupformuseums.org to register, and to use that, as we showed you, through the congressional site to send letters to your legislators, and of course your government relations team is here to help. And here's all the contact information for your government relations team. They, I know, work tirelessly, because sometimes I get emails from them at like 3 o'clock in the morning to make sure that all of your issues are heard in Washington, D.C. So with that, I'm going to check to see if we've got any other questions at this point. And I think we're good. So remember, all of these materials are going to be available on the speakupformuseums.org site. You'll get access to all the templates and everything I showed you, and want to thank you for taking the time to start your advocacy planning with us today, and we hope to see you on a future session. Thanks so much.